Uncut Gems is now almost 4 years old, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it the entire time. I'm starting to really annoy the people around me because of it. If you're between the ages of 18 to 40, chances are you probably saw Uncut Gems when it first came out in 2019. The film got a lot of critical attention at the time, but it seems like most of the casual audiences who went to see Uncut Gems absolutely hated it. If you look through some of the audience reviews, the same few things keep coming up. There aren't any morally good characters, it's very anxiety inducing, and anyone who likes it has to have something wrong with them. And that's why it was my favorite movie of 2019. Either way, a lot of people saw Uncut Gems, and I know that because the people who distributed the movie, A24, said it was their highest grossing movie ever till Everything Everywhere All at Once came out. And that's excluding the fact that Netflix bought the international distribution rights. Most people were probably drawn in by the fact that the movie starred Adam Sandler, but it looked really different to most of his stuff. It's easy to forget about now, but back in the 2010s, Adam Sandler had kind of built a reputation for himself. He made a lot of movies that did extremely poor with critics, but somehow kept making insane box office returns. For some reason, coming off all of this, Adam Sandler agreed to do Uncut Gems. It doesn't really make any sense. I guess he just felt like making something good again, like Punch Drunk Love, since it definitely couldn't have been for the paycheck. Uncut Gems only had a budget of $19 million. In 2020, Adam Sandler's net worth was $420, which is funny because it's the weed number, right? Let's quickly talk about what Uncut Gems actually is. It's a crime movie where Adam Sandler plays Howard Ratner, a Jewish jewelry store owner whose shop is located in New York's Diamond District. Apparently Howard worked on tons of hip-hop music videos years ago, and you can kinda tell he can't let that go.
I used to work with niggas on early music videos, all that shit. You like the first nigga to start all that.
I started that shit.
Show me fucking eyes.
He's still respected, kind of. He still manages to get celebrities like Kevin Garnett coming into his store to buy stuff, so he must be doing something right. But despite the critical praise it got, Uncut Gems is in kind of a funny place. I think a lot of people look at it like a transitionary film. The directors, Josh and Benny Safdie, have been moving in this direction for a while. They made 5 feature films together before even tackling Uncut Gems. It's far higher budget than any of their previous movies, and if anything, Uncut Gems is more of a development of their previous style rather than something entirely new. It came and went, and most people just want to see what the Safdies make next, which I think is something with Nathan Fielder, but I think Uncut Gems deserves a closer look. It feels unfair to write off a movie after only watching it once, since it takes thousands of hours to make one. One of the most fascinating aspects of Uncut Gems is how it creates this dissonance between how Howard sees himself and how the movie presents him. And because of that, Howard is this walking, talking contradiction. He somehow comes across from the outside as this terrible guy, and at the same time as this deeply tragic figure. The film manages to use this disconnected presentation to discuss things like class, wealth, and even modern day business. And that's really one of the most interesting things about Uncut Gems. It's a period piece set in an era that doesn't really get period pieces. It's set in the far distant year of 2012. In 2012, Kevin Garnett's at the peak of his NBA career, Adam Sandler's phone uses outdated iOS, and Gangnam Style is still the funniest shit in the world. A lot of modern movies aren't very good at talking about what life is like today. Up till the 2010s, a lot of diverse movies were coming out on this topic, like American Graffiti, or American Beauty, or American Pie. It's really difficult to think of a good, recent movie that does this, except Twin Peaks. You usually end up with something that's cringe, or essentially a YouTube video, or both. I don't really think people remember just how fast everything changed. Like this Stephen A. Smith tweet is pretty infamous, with the joke being that he doesn't really understand how computers or the internet work. It's from 2015, and also in 2012 the entire world was coming out of an economic recession. Both of those, I would say, are still relevant today. And Uncut Gems was advertised in a way to specifically capitalize off this. There were shots of expensive alcohol, nightclubs, and jewelry, and the whole thing was set to a remix of a Travis Scott and Weeknd song. It was deliberately trying to get you to think about an unsustainable upper-class city lifestyle. Picture Succession, but with more swearing somehow. But I guarantee that every single person who saw Uncut Gems because of this trailer was 100% surprised. Because the first shot of the movie isn't New York or Adam Sandler, It's helicopter footage of an Ethiopian opal mine. The trailer is specifically cut together using cooler blue colors, a heavy use of shadows, and these claustrophobic shots. But when the movie starts, you see this ocean of yellow, all this exposure coming from the sun, and the widest open framing that's possible. And the first real thing that happens in the movie is an Ethiopian miner having their leg broken because of how horrific the working conditions are. It's designed to catch you off guard. Pretty soon after, a fight breaks out around the injured miner, and these two guys use the chaos to go steal a black opal, and then ship it over to New York. And it's only after all of that we finally see Adam Sandler. The rest of the movie takes place in New York and follows Howard as he constantly makes bad decisions while trying to sell the gem for a profit. We never see Ethiopia again, not directly anyway, but the transition between the two countries says everything. When the Ethiopian miners pick up the opal, the camera zooms into it going into this weird CGI kaleidoscopic ride, and then it emerges back out in New York. Okay, this is Jay from the future. I can't actually show you the full scene for two reasons. One, it goes on for like 5 minutes and it would take way too long. And two, when the film zooms out back in New York, it zooms out of Adam Sandler's colon as he's lying on a bed getting a colonoscopy. I'm not joking, that's really how the movie starts. I swear it's good. Please keep watching. Okay, back to the video. All of this happens without a single cut, and the movie even has a second introduction when it's in New York. Now it's 2 years later. The fact it doesn't cut is so important to me, because it visually symbolizes that even though these two places are worlds apart in culture, time, and location, they're still directly connected. It's hard to remember that sometimes. When you see stuff in your local supermarket, you don't think about how it gets there, but it probably came from across the world if it wasn't made locally. And Uncut Gems doesn't ever let you forget where the black opal came from. The CGI transition at the start is such a big spectacle that anytime you see the opal on screen, it's impossible to not think about how it came to New York in the first place. In many ways, the story of Howard Ratner is like a classical tragedy, like the Odyssey, Othello, or Tobuscus. And as the hero of a classical tragedy, Howard has to have one fatal flaw. Well, he's got a lot of them actually, but I think it all stems from one main one: his giant ego, which comes out a lot of the time as a manic mental state, and the film tries its best to put you into Howard's frame of mind, and that makes you naturally want to take his side. Part of the way the movie expresses this is through the set design. Most of the scenes in the movie are deliberately trying to disorient you. You have tons of reflective material in every scene, and there's plenty of eye-catching fluorescent colors. Your attention is purposefully meant to be being drawn everywhere over the screen, and a lot of the time, Howard's physical location in a scene isn't very clear. Pretty frequently, you see him through screens or obscured by these translucent materials. The film's deliberately putting a lot of layers between us as the viewer and Howard. When you look at how scenes in Uncut Gems are usually blocked, pretty often the person who's talking isn't even the focus of the camera. It kinda looks like a video you'd see on World Star Hip Hop. In fact, Uncut Gems doesn't really behave the way you think a movie should. Like if a film school professor was telling you how to make a movie, the main thing they'd say is, make the film as easy as possible for a viewer to follow. You don't want your audience to be inconvenienced watching it because it could turn people off. So what Uncut Gems does is listen to that advice and completely ignore it. One of the best examples of this is the scene where we're introduced to Howard. It's this giant 5-minute long sequence where we see Howard go through a typical day. If we break down how the scene flows and go through the cuts one by one, it becomes obvious pretty quickly they're trying to break your line of sight. Because if you're looking at Howard, which you probably are because he's the main character, your eye constantly has to reorient itself to figure out where he is in the scene. Like here you get this shot of Howard walking into the store that's framed from the front of him, and then in the next cut you see the back of him, and then after that we're back to the front again. And even more subtle than that, in the first shot Howard's walking from left to right, in the second, right to left, and then in the third it's back to left to right again. The New York scenes are genuinely more chaotic than the Ethiopian ones. The film professor would have probably already lost it by this point, but the whole movie's also got this harsh electronic synthy score that's mixed purposefully to completely wash out the dialogue. And even if you could hear what was being said, you still wouldn't be able to understand it, because there's always at least like 4 people talking over each other at the same time. The reason I think Uncut Gems does this is because it desperately wants you to relate to Howard and make you think of him as a real person who's alive in the world. Life is chaotic, life is messy, and life is swearing. It isn't as neat and structured as a movie is. That's why the film is so dedicated towards recreating 2012 as faithfully as possible. It's kinda like being hypnotized. But here's the thing, Uncut Gems really wants you to be on Howard's side and see things from his perspective. But Howard isn't a good guy, and you know that because someone made a page for him on the official Villains Wiki. There's tons of great media about getting to understand terrible characters and loving them despite that, but it's especially weird with Uncut Gems. Tony Soprano is charismatic. Don Draper is charismatic. Howard is annoying. He's so annoying that other characters in the movie call him annoying.
I think you are the most annoying person I have ever met. I hate being with you, I hate looking at you, and if I had my way, I would never see you again.
It's 'cause you're mad.
Adam Sandler's performance is so great because he manages to make this completely despicable guy incredibly fascinating to watch. It makes no sense. Howard is like a side character in a GTA game who keeps giving you missions, and then you end up killing him because someone cooler asked you to. I think a lot of people interpret the Uncut Gem in the title as a reference to Howard. I've definitely heard the Safdies say this. I disagree. You know, he definitely does do a couple of nice things, but make no mistake, Howard sucks in more ways than you might initially think. On the surface, he's extremely rude towards his girlfriend, who's also his employee, by the way, boss of the year. And he's like this with all of his employees. Well, he doesn't date them, but he's rude to them. There's a subcategory of characters in Uncut Gems who are working class people, but when I say that, I'm not talking about the people who work for Howard or anything like that. I mean people who barely get any screen time or lines, because these people don't even exist to Howard, so they don't get to exist in the film. Like the guy who delivers the black opal at the start. Howard doesn't even make eye contact with him and only asks about the package.
Give me that.
Or Roman, who's an employee that Howard yells orders at the whole movie. I didn't even know his name was Roman till I looked it up. But the best example is about halfway through the movie, where Howard, completely because of his own actions, makes his father-in-law lose almost 200 grand. You have this giant long scene that starts in a hotel lobby and follows the two of them all the way out as Howard is constantly saying sorry and kissing his father-in-law's butt. But then after all of that, all of this fake niceness, he just demeans his father-in-law's chauffeur.
It's all right. Okay, thanks. Get him going. Open the fucking door. What's he waiting for you for? Okay.
It's not all bad, he does get his nose broken. Once you start to notice this behavior, it's in like every scene. He tells this guy to fuck off, he tells that guy to fuck off. His third line in the movie is telling someone to fuck off. Howard looks at all of these workers not as people, but instead as services. He thinks he can get away with treating them terribly because, well, he can. It's the same logic that makes people go out and scream at retail employees. They only see them as their jobs. They're horrible people. Bizarrely, Uncut Gems takes this relationship even further and looks at it from the opposite perspective. Uncut Gems tries to make you think that the objects in the film are alive. Look, I realize how crazy that sounds, but I swear I can explain it. The first pendant you see in the movie is this one of Michael Jackson on the cross. It raises the idea of taking humans and converting them into objects that you can purchase or sell. But you and I both know this is an object, right? We're talking metaphorically, that's not really Michael Jackson in there. What about the Furbies though? Okay, Furbies are toys, obviously. They're not real living things, but they're meant to look like something that's alive, right? I mean, I don't know what, maybe like a short rabbit? But when we think of Furbies, they have their own category in our heads, like animals do. That's a cat, that's a dog, that's a Furby. By the way, have you ever looked at a Furby with the outside fur removed? It's demonic. Your brain doesn't interpret it as some motors or wires, it just looks like it's alive, and probably suffering too. The Furby that's featured in Uncut Gems goes a step further. It sort of exists in a limbo state. It's jewel encrusted, which is purposefully drawing attention to how artificial it is, because it reminds you that it's made by someone, but at the same time, they've rigged the Furby so its eyes can move. In an interview with Vulture, Josh Safdie described the Furby by saying, quote, "There was this sadness in the eyes, like these things are trapped inside this materialist object." Watching a film is a very passive experience. It's all about looking at something that's been put in front of you. So to have something in the movie stare back and make direct eye contact with you is pretty piercing, even if it is just a manufactured children's toy doing it. In other words, the Furby in the film, the toy, has had life injected into it. Like Frankenstein. Uncut Gems goes as far as to make you think the opal's alive too, genuinely trying to make it seem as if this rock has magical properties somehow. The first time Howard looks at it, his eyes digitally shrink. like he's been possessed or something. In fact, they do technically give the gem a full mythology story as well. I've already talked about how Uncut Gems starts with a scene that's completely disconnected from the rest of the film, but it also takes place in a different time and location where a group of people find a mysterious foreign object. It's strongly hinted at having magical connotations through an expensive CGI sequence, and then the rest of the movie is about modern day people trying to retrieve it and deal with its supernatural consequences. Now, everything I just said is also the plot of The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser. That's how lost in the sauce Howard is. I genuinely believe Howard loves his family, but I also believe that above all of that, Howard only sees people for what they can provide to him. Not just his employees, but his family too. His daughter hates him because he shows no interest in her life, his son only likes him because kids have no money, and he's getting a divorce through the entire film. Oh yeah, he's married by the way, and he has a girlfriend during all of this, boss of the year again. Before the movie even starts, Howard's already borrowed $100 grand from his brother-in-law, Arno. And apparently at one point Howard had enough money to pay him back and resurfaced his swimming pool instead. So the entire time you're watching the movie, Howard has a bunch of loan sharks chasing him that Arno's hired to try get his money back. He treats objects and literal stones better than he does most of the living, breathing people that are in his life. And while I'm here, like, you know jewelry isn't really worth anything either, right? Like, have you ever heard of a synthetic diamond? It's a diamond that they make in a lab that's quite cheap and ethical to make, and it looks exactly the same as a diamond that comes from a mine. But jewelry stores market it as if it's a cheaper, dirty equivalent to a real mined diamond. That's how made up this whole industry is. That's how made up most businesses. Isn't that the business model of NFTs? I thought the point of jewelry was that it looked nice. Who's buying these like they're on StockX? The whole movie, Howard's going on about how he thinks the black opal is worth over $1 million. And about 2/3 of the way through, there's this scene where the black opal's value gets reappraised, and it falls from 1.2 million to 200 grand in a second. For something to fall that much without actually changing, it's almost as if the price it was being sold at was just made up, and that no concept of the thing's actual value came into setting the price. Buy my bored apes, by the way. Anyway, after Howard gets his teeth knocked out by a couple of loan sharks, and nobody around him cares because it's New York, he goes back to his jewelry store. Up till this point in the movie, Garnett's been trying to buy the opal from Howard, but because Howard thought it was worth over $1 million, he kept saying no. But since then, it's been reappraised to way less, and Howard just wants any money back. So anyway, Howard calls up Garnett and says, "Come over, I'll sell the opal to you," which he does. And then Howard calls up Arno and says he can finally pay back his debt to him. Howard then immediately takes that money and puts it on a $200,000 bet, and the bet itself is so stupid and relies on so many things to go right that it feels like he just shredded the money in front of you. He puts all of his faith into the gem and thinks Kevin Garnett is gonna play out of his mind later that night. You can tell it's mostly stemming from his desperation and his ego. It's a bit like Faust, the story about a man selling his soul to the devil to get everything he wants. Should've read the small print. On paper, this scene's a conversation between Adam Sandler's character Howard and Kevin Garnett. But I think a better way to think about it would be like the climactic final battle scene in a movie. Because believe it or not, this scene is directly connected to another film, Akira. Like that Akira. Like the movie that made anime cool, Akira. The song that kicks in the moment Howard decides to place the bet is called Windows, which is itself a remix of a song from Akira, Kaneda's theme. Kaneda being the main character of Akira, and a country. And this isn't just me making some shit up and pretending it's real. Daniel Lopatin, the composer of the film, even admitted this on Twitter. Kaneda's theme is this heavy percussion-based song that they used to score the action scenes in Akira. Scenes of people on motorbikes, explosions going off, the entire universe being destroyed. It's all scored by this one song. If there's one thing Kaneda's theme captures, it's high-level conflict, and that's the song they remixed to score this conversation in Uncut Gems. It feels like the entire world could explode at any point, even though it's still just Howard's problems. What would you say the most iconic line from Uncut Gems is? Even if you haven't seen it, you probably know the line. It's when Howard turns to Kevin Garnett and says,
Come on, KG, this is no different than that. This is me. Alright? I'm not a fucking athlete. This is my fucking way. This is how I win.
It's so popular that the phrase itself has been clipped out and turned into a meme. Quality of the memes aside, look at how every single one uses the phrase. They're all taking the quote and putting it into exceptionally low stakes and petty contexts that don't really mean anything besides threatening someone's ego. Because whether you consciously realize it or not, that's what this scene is saying. When Howard says this is how I win, that's not what he means. What he's saying is, it's not enough for me to win, I need everyone else to lose. And that's why using a bet at the end of the movie is the perfect metaphor for Howard's philosophy. His victory is defined entirely by other people losing. The money doesn't mean anything to Howard. It's a game and he just needs a win. At no point does Howard ever consider the fact that the black opal isn't doing anything. It was shipped to him by Ethiopian miners who are surrounded by those things, like the movie even says that, and I wouldn't exactly describe them as lucky. And Kevin Garnett buying it and playing a basketball game has nothing to do with the gem. The gem is not involved in this transaction. It's a rock.
The nigga just offered you $250,000 for a fucking rock, dummy.
Surprise! The Adam Sandler movie that starts by zooming out of his butt is actually about capitalism. But you already knew that, because that's what every video essay is about. And then Uncut Gems does something so incredible towards the end. Something so out of left field that I can't believe they did it. Howard wins the bet. Was the gem actually magic? Seriously, I was like frozen watching this the first time I saw it. The entire movie is about teaching you that the gem does nothing. The gem setup is magical to represent Howard's perspective, but they also remind you that real people in a real country had to mine, suffer, and ship it over to New York. There's this moment while you're watching Howard's bet play out, where it goes from watching one man's delusion to watching a miracle. But like every deal someone makes with the devil, Howard ends up paying the ultimate price and gets killed by one of Arno's hired gangsters. Suddenly, all of that dissonance, all of that contradictory complexity that was used to define Howard unravels entirely. Now, a lot of films are completely content to let you wallow in the contradiction, and that's perfectly fine. Scorsese's films do this, and he was an executive producer on Uncut Gems. But the movie goes one step further, and when Howard dies, suddenly the weight of all of his actions come into question. There's this phrase that's been around forever about how people die two deaths, that's attributed to Ernest Hemingway and also Banksy. Quote, "Every man has two deaths, when he is buried in the ground and the last time someone says his name." Once Howard dies, his life turns into a story. Is it something to learn from? Something to look up to? It doesn't matter that Howard would have, in all likelihood, wasted the money, because at that point the narrative has changed. Howard was always justifying his actions in the present by saying it was for his future. But once Howard dies, his actions can't be defined in that way anymore because his future has literally ceased to exist. All of his short-term thinking has eroded the long-term. And that's when the film turns to you and asks you to make a judgment on Howard's character. You don't even see the moment Howard wins the bet.
Did we just win? Oh my fucking god, are you kidding me?
Instead, you're with his girlfriend Julia, and you have to wait for her reaction to even understand that Howard won. The film's been delaying this decision the whole time, and the reason it's so hard to make is because Howard's mentality is absurdly common in real life. Uncut Gems dedicates itself to trying to be set in the real world, and people in real life aren't cartoonishly evil. Even the worst person you can think of probably thinks of themselves as a good person. Maybe you've heard of this idea of the self-made man, the idea that one person could construct their entire legacy and success alone. But it's not true. Everybody is connected to everybody else. Success, especially in relation to money, is directly defined by your connection to other people. Who else is paying you? You can't just keep selling things. Eventually someone needs to buy them. What Uncut Gems does at the end is show that Howard's perception of himself and how he sees the world is wrong. He doesn't see the other side of the transaction. He sees every single thing in his life as selling to someone. Just as his giant ego shows, he thinks he's the self-made man, but at every critical stage he's exploiting other people, whether it's his family, his employees, or the Ethiopian miners. Those people who, quote-unquote, make it, have an absurd amount of luck on their sides. What if Howard had just been born in Ethiopia instead? You could easily interpret Howard's story as about a man who always believed in himself when no one else would. But you would have to conveniently not remember the bits where he crushed the people around him to get there. What Uncut Gems does is confront you with your own biases. All the facts are laid in front of you, and it asks, what do you think happened? Maybe that's why the film ends with a 90s trance rave track playing over the credits. It knows for a fact that nobody really wants to dwell on something like this. Which is what Andre 3000 did in the song Hey Ya. So I think the real moral of Uncut Gems is, go listen to some Outkast. Atlians is great.